This is an oral history interview conducted for the project Witness to War Serving a Nation. For the sake of the interview, please state your name, military rank, and birthplace.
My name is William Blaisdell. My rank was Specialist 4th Class in the United States Army, and my birthplace was Natick, Massachusetts.
So, how did you end up on Cape Cod?
Well, when I finished my career, my professional career, I decided that I wanted to come down towards the ocean. So just before I decided to leave the telephone company, I started looking for a home. And in 1994, I looked everywhere down here on Cape Cod, and I finally found a house in Mashpee. And the reason I moved down here is I just wanted to be close to the ocean.
And where did you grow up, and what was that like?
I grew up in Natick, Massachusetts. It was a pretty small town at the time. I moved to Natick when I was just several months old. I was born in Boston, and my parents bought a home. My father had just gotten back from World War II and had decided to buy a home in 1949, which was the year that I was born, in Natick, Massachusetts. So that's where I grew up, and I grew up with, I was the second of 5 children. I had an older sister and a younger brother and 2 younger sisters.
Having so many siblings, what was that like?
Very competitive, but we were a very, very close-knit family. My brother and I fought a lot, but a lot of brothers do. We're the best of friends today, which is many, many years later. And it was a great life, great life. We had great parents. My father worked as an engineer. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. Back in those days, that's what most moms were. And we just were like a normal American family.
And what was your family and friends' reaction to you being enlisted or drafted into the military?
Well, that's a pretty interesting question because it was kind of a mixed reaction. I'll give you a little background on what happened. At the time, I had graduated from high school, and I was very smart in high school, but I didn't grade very well because I never really applied myself, like I'm sure you guys do. But I was very smart. I tested very well, and I applied, I think, to a half a dozen colleges, and I got into all of them. And I ended up going to Boston College. And at the end of my first year at Boston College, I got myself in some trouble. I crashed my mother's car. This all happened over a 24-hour period. Crashed my mother's car, got into a fight after the crash, got arrested, and put in jail. And once I got out of jail, I went to the hospital because I had gotten hurt pretty bad in the fight after the crash. I did get hurt in the crash. And I knew I was going to have to go to court for my actions. My father and mother brought me home from the hospital, and we got the mail that day, and I got a letter from Boston College saying that I had flunked out. So all in a 24-hour period, I crashed my mother's car. I got in a pretty big fight. I was arrested, and I flunked out of college. And I joined the service.
Wow.
So the next day, I had to go to court, and the judge said to me, he called my case, and he said, let's face the facts here, son. You're guilty, and you're gonna go to jail. And I said back to him, how could I be guilty? I haven't had a trial. And the judge said to me, step up to the bench. And I stepped up in front of the bench in court, and he said, I'm gonna give you a trial, I'm gonna find you guilty, and I'm gonna put you in jail. So the only way out of this is if you join the service. And I said to him, I joined the service yesterday. And he said, prove it. So I showed him my enlistment papers, and he said, step back. And he said, case dismissed. And he said to his clerk, make sure this young man actually has enlisted and gets inducted. And that's how I ended up joining the Army.
Wow.
When I got home that night, back in those days, every night at dinner time was family dinner. My father would work all day and then come home, and the children and my mother would wait for my father to get home. When he came home from dinner, they said to me, I said, I have something to tell you. And they said, what? And I said, I enlisted in the Army today. My brother and my sisters kind of just looked astonished. My mother started crying, and my father said, yes, great. And that was how I ended up joining the Army.
How did you end up becoming a medic?
Well, when I went to the enlistment office, I asked the enlistment sergeant, when he asked me what I wanted to do, I didn't know. And I said, what could I do? And he gave me a list of all the things that you could possibly do in the service. And you have to remember, this was in 1968, which was right in the middle of the Vietnam War. You probably don't know a lot about that war, but it was kind of a crazy war. And I looked at the list of things that I could enlist for, and I just decided, maybe I'll be a medic. And he let me sign up to be a medic. And no particular reason why I chose that. I just thought it looked interesting at the time.
Serving as a medic, describe what that was like.
Well, first of all, you have to understand, I went through basic training, and then I had to go to school to become a medic. And I went to a place called Fort Sam Houston out in San Antonio, Texas. And what they do is they put you through 10 weeks of learning life-saving techniques. To be a medic is more or less, it's a little different than like a paramedic in today's society that goes around on ambulances and goes to car accidents and things like that. A medic back in those days, you were out in the field taking care of people that had been shot or wounded. So you had to learn those kinds of life-saving techniques, and I did that for 10 weeks, and I was very good at it. I finally found something that I could do well without getting in trouble. And as soon as I graduated from becoming a medic, I had done so well, they allowed me to move on to another school, which was something called Operating Room Technician School, where I learned how to be an operating room technician who assists surgeons during surgery in the operating room. So that's what I wanted to do, and I figured that would kind of keep me safe, because I knew there was a war going on, and if I had enhanced skills, medical skills, I might avoid having to go fight in the war, and I might be assigned to a hospital where I'd work in an operating room. That was my plan at the time.
How did that plan come out?
It didn't. I went through operating room technician school. Again, that was also in Texas. And then I did my on-the-job training in a hospital operating room, actually at Fort Devens in Massachusetts. And I worked in that operating room assisting doctors during surgeries to learn and become more proficient at my skills. And then I got my orders, and my orders were to go to Vietnam. So I still wasn't too concerned because I figured, well, I'm an operating room technician now, so the worst that's going to happen is they'll send me to a hospital in Vietnam to work in the operating rooms there. When I got my orders, I had to go out to a base on the West Coast called Fort Lewis, Washington, which was the deployment fort for people that are leaving the country to go to Vietnam. And I checked in there, and the sergeant at the desk there said to me, he looked my papers up, and he said, okay, you're going to the 1st Infantry Division. And I said to him, that can't be right, that must be a mistake. And he said to me, what do you mean? And I said, I used some words that I think you might even be aware of that are kind of funny words that are very common in this area of the country. I looked at him and I said, do you know who I am? And he's kind of smiled at me and he goes, yes, I know who you are. You're a medic and you're going to Vietnam and you're going to be in a combat infantry unit. Now take your papers and move along. That's how I ended up going to Vietnam as a combat medic.
While serving, what was over your entire service as a medic, what was your bravest moment?
My what?
Bravest.
Bravest?
Yes.
Well, I can tell you a couple of stories about what happened when I first got there. When I first got there, I really didn't know what I was doing, what I was supposed to do. I got assigned to an infantry platoon, and within 2 days, I was sent out on a field mission. And within hours, we got into a firefight. We were under attack. And I said to the medic that I was replacing in this platoon, he had already been there almost a year, and I was going to be his replacement. I said to him, what do? I don't know what I'm doing. And he said, just follow me, be quiet, just do what I tell you to do. And bullets were flying, shrapnel flying all around. And the next thing I know, and people were getting wounded. And the next thing I knew, the medic that I was there to replace and the medic that was to train me was shot and killed. So now I was the only medic left in the platoon, and I don't know if you've ever seen any movies or anything, you hear people when they get shot, they scream out, medic. Well, it's not really the way it worked over there. What they yelled out would be doc, because all the infantry guys that I was familiar with didn't call him medic, they called him doc. So they started screaming doc, and then I realized their doc was gone, and I was doc. So it was pretty hectic, and I had to run around and take care of, can't remember how many guys got killed that day, but I think there were 4 or 5 of the soldiers in my platoon were shot and killed. And I had to try and figure out very quickly who was I going to medevac out first, who was I going to take care of first. So that was my trial by fire after only a few days in Vietnam. So that was one of the, I don't know if it was the bravest moment, it was brave by necessity, because I was the only one left that was going to be able to take care of the guys who were wounded. So that was kind of my first experience in Vietnam.
Right. Out of all your many experiences as a medic, which one was your most memorable?
That certainly comes to the top of the list. I would think the most memorable, though, was a little bit less crazy. Like, I ran into those kinds of crazy moments many, many times. We were in firefights very often, lots of people getting wounded, lots of people getting killed. But in the second half of my tour of duty in Vietnam, I was transferred to a field hospital. Actually, it was an aid station, if you will. And we had 2 helipads right outside our tent. And helicopters would go out and pick up the most seriously wounded, the medevac helicopters. And if they were really, really serious, they would fly them back to our station where we would perform life-saving techniques so that they could then be further evacuated to a surgical hospital. So I did that for the last about 4 months of the time that I was in Vietnam. But the real thing that made the most impact on me at that station, although we treated many, many, many soldiers, we implemented a program, and at the time the Vietnam War was not very popular back in the United States, and there was a lot of bad press about things that were being done over in Vietnam, that American soldiers were possibly doing things that weren't probably the most correct things in the world. But my experience was completely different. We implemented a program where we would twice a week go out into the local villages in a ambulance, an army ambulance, and we made arrangements with the village chief that we would be coming there and we would treat civilians, men, women, children, and in some cases, enemy that had been wounded by us. But we went in there and we told them there'd be no questions asked, that we would treat anybody, and all we wanted in return was a guarantee that we would be safe when we went into these villages, and that we wouldn't be ambushed or killed. And we went in twice a week and treated many, many civilians, saved a lot of lives of children, women, innocent civilians. And at the same time, I know for a fact we often treated enemy, but we never asked questions, we just did the treatment. And I'd like to believe that most of the Americans were like me over there, where if somebody was sick or somebody was wounded or somebody was dying, they're no longer the enemy, even if they were just a wounded human being that needed treatment. And that's the way I ended my last 4 months of service in Vietnam, was just treating these people in the villages and doing as much good as we could for the actual local people.
Moving from, being in lots of firefights to the helicopter station and then to the village, were those transitions good transitions in your eyes, or?
They were very, very good transitions. And one of the things I was going to tell you gentlemen, that I've spoken twice now to at something called Veterans Town Hall here in Barnstable, and I've given like 10-minute speeches on my experiences in war, and the transition from crazy firefights to rear line work where you're treating soldiers and then going into villages, it was all good. I mean, it was never safe, it was always still crazy, but we made a lot of progress and we saved a lot of people's lives. And in these 2 speeches that I gave in Barnstable, one of the things I remember quoting was I kept a diary when I was over in Vietnam. I haven't taken it out in many years, but there were two numbers that I remember specifically that I keep in the back of my mind. The two numbers were 182 and 62. And that sounds like very strange numbers to just keep in mind, but the numbers, based on my best recollection of my time in Vietnam, I know that I treated personally 182 men who would have died had I not treated them, and they lived. And 62 men who I treated and they died. And so I was the last person, or the last hand they held, or whatever. So those two numbers really kind of stuck in my mind for the rest of my life. I'll never forget those two numbers. But in a way, I'm very proud that I was able to personally save 182 lives. Very sad that I lost 62, but those numbers will never leave my memory.
Wow. So during your time in the village, or during that time when you were in that infantry platoon, at any point were your morals ever challenged or called into question?
Not mine. No, never. As a matter of fact, I always stood up for what I thought was right. Very often, we would have casualties brought into us who were not Americans. They were not South Vietnamese, who were our allies. They were North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. And as I said earlier when I was speaking, once somebody was wounded, in my eyes, they just became a human being. They weren't an American, they weren't a South Vietnamese, they weren't a North Vietnamese, they weren't a friend, they weren't a foe, they were humans. And I got into a few battles with people that didn't feel quite that same way. And I kind of understood it because they had just seen their own friends shot and killed by the enemy, and now the enemy is laying on a table in my treatment room, wounded, and they were angry. They wanted, and I had to stop on more than one occasion people from doing something that shouldn't have been done. And I took some heat for it from some other Americans because they thought that I was being too nice to the enemy, but I tried to explain myself that they're not the enemy once they're wounded. Once they're wounded, they're just human beings. So it was pretty intense.
You certainly were serving and doing your work with other people. Who was the most influential person you worked with?
I would have to say the commanding officer I worked for my last 4 months in Vietnam. His name was Captain Theron K. Weatherby. I'll remember it to this day. And I've told stories when I came back from the service. I had a couple of close friends that I would share some stories with. And I remember one day, one of my friends challenged me and said, you tell these stories. And I said, I don't tell those stories to too many people, because I didn't talk a lot about the war. But to very close friends I would. He said, I sometimes wonder if all of these are true. And I said, well, let's look up Dr. Theron K. Weatherby on the internet. This was a number of years ago. And we looked up, there aren't too many people in the world named Theron K. Weatherby, so we looked him up, and I found a doctor in Minnesota named Theron K. Weatherby. So I called him, and he answered the phone, and I said, is this Dr. Weatherby? And he said, yes. Who is this? And I said, you might not remember me, But my name is Bill Blaisdell, and I served under your command in Vietnam. And he goes, "Oh my God, I remember you well." He was the guy that I admired the most because he taught me so much about how to save people's lives. He taught me how to put in things that I had no right doing. I was putting in chest tubes to people that had sucking chest wounds, doing tracheotomies on people, all because he taught me how. And I was able to save multiple lives just because he taught me. And he did remember me, and it was 40-something years later.
When you came into contact with Mr. Weatherby,
Dr. Weatherby.
Dr. Weatherby, did you kind of resume the sort of bonding that you had while you were working?
We only talked on the phone, and we only talked that one time. I have never spoken other than that one time to Dr. Weatherby. I've never spoken to anybody that I served with in Vietnam ever again. We were close while we were there because our lives depended on each other. But when we left there, it's probably unlike most wars. Most wars, people seem to have established relationships. I know my father was in World War II, and he still talked to people that he served with in World War II for many, many years afterwards. In Vietnam, maybe it was different for other people, but for me, never spoke to another person that I served with, even though I was as close as you can get while we were together. When we got out, we never spoke. Very strange.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel leaving Vietnam and going home?
Well, that's another good question because I didn't leave like most people. I was evacuated out medically. I got hurt when I was over in Vietnam, my last few months there, and I was evacuated to a hospital in Saigon first, which is now called Ho Chi Minh City, I think. And from there, I was evacuated to a hospital in Japan. And I was in Japan probably for maybe a month and a half in a hospital. And then I was evacuated from Japan to Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. And I was there for a couple of nights. And then from Walter Reed Army Hospital, I was transferred to Chelsea Naval Hospital in Boston, where I spent another 3 or 4 months. And I was pretty much paralyzed on my entire right side at the time. And by the time I had been in Chelsea Naval Hospital, I finally got a call from a doctor. He called me into his office, and he said, "We've done everything we can possibly do," and I still couldn't really move my right arm, or my right side was pretty bad. He said, "There's nothing more we can do for you, and you've got two choices. You can stay in the service, or I can write up papers and discharge you, and we'll discharge you with an 80% disability." And I just said, "Show me the papers." And I signed, and I was discharged from the service with a 80% disability, and I didn't have any hope that I was ever going to be normal again, be able to use my body the way I could at the time, before the war, but I chose to leave. And over many years, over time, I was able to get back to, I was never back to complete normal, but back to better. And so that was my trip home from Vietnam.
What was the reception from your family like when you finally got back?
The reception from my personal family, my mother, my father, my brothers, my sisters, and my very close relatives was overwhelmingly great.
Sorry.
That's okay. They were all happy to see me alive, because when I was in Japan, in the hospital in Japan, because my right side was paralyzed and I'm a right-handed, I couldn't really write very well, and I didn't want to write with my left hand, so I had a nurse write a letter to my mother to say that I had been evacuated to Japan and that I'd be coming home soon. And of course, she immediately thought I'd lost my arm because I couldn't write. So she had all these visions going through her head, because back then there was no communication. I got one phone call the whole time I was in Vietnam, and that was, I got no phone calls in Vietnam. When I was in Japan, they let me make one phone call, and it was a 60-second call to my home, and that was the only time I ever spoke to anyone. And I told my mother that I was okay and that I'd be coming home. So it was pretty traumatic.
After returning, looking back now, what life lessons do you think you learned from your experience in Vietnam?
I think probably that human being life is the most important thing in the world. And whether you're my enemy, or you're my friend, or you're my fellow soldier, or you're someone I tried to kill 5 minutes ago, we're all human beings, and war is a horrible thing, and once somebody is a wounded person, they're just, as I said earlier, just a human being, and they deserve all the dignity and all the treatment and all the care you can possibly give them. And that's the way I've handled my whole life, and that's why I'm doing what I do today here in these offices, helping veterans that are coming back from other wars.
People who have never experienced anything close to combat or any of the things that are experienced in war are going to be seeing this interview. Paint them a picture of what it was like.
It was, as I said, when I first got off the plane in Vietnam, I was totally petrified. Don't believe anybody that says I was ready to go and I'm ready to go get everyone, and that's not the way it works. Anybody that says they're not afraid is lying to you. I was petrified the second I got off the plane, and I don't think there was ever a day or a night in the time that I was in Vietnam that I was not afraid that I was going to get killed any moment. So I really came out of it understanding that war is the worst thing in the world. I wish there was never any war. I wish it all could be settled somewhere at a table like we're sitting at. And when you do have to go to war, it's just a most frightening experience. And you just somehow pull yourself together and do what has to be done.
How would you define hero?
I would say the real true heroes are the ones that didn't come back. They're the true heroes. I'm not a hero. I saved people's lives. I was doing my job. The heroes are the people that they lost their lives doing what they thought was the right thing to do, and they no longer exist. It's hard to pin a medal on someone and say, now you're a hero. No, I'm not the hero. The heroes are the people that didn't quite make it.
Knowing what you know now, would you do anything differently?
No, I would not do anything differently. I mean, I learned a long time ago the shoulda, woulda, couldas. That doesn't mean anything to anybody, anywhere, and it doesn't help anybody, anytime, anywhere. I sometimes do that, and I think we all do. What if I had done this, or what if I had done that? It just doesn't work. What I'd rather do is look back and say, I think I did the best I possibly could, and I'm not gonna second guess anything I ever did. I did everything to the best of my ability, and I don't have any second questions about how I lived my life or how I did things.
Thank you, Mr. Blaisdell. Is there anything you would like to add?
One last thing I was going to add. A lot of people don't really understand what happened in Vietnam. It was a completely different war than the wars prior to it or the wars after it. Vietnam was a very strange war. Number one, it was a war that was, I don't know the percentages, but a good many of the soldiers that fought in Vietnam were drafted. They weren't volunteers. Almost all of the soldiers that are in the service today are volunteers. There is no draft right now. So what that meant was that a lot of the soldiers that went to Vietnam were very young. And I pulled together, for the last speech I gave in Barnstable, I pulled together some numbers, which I have right here in front of me. And I think you'll find these pretty astonishing. There were 58,000 plus men and women killed in Vietnam. And what do you think the average age was? Average of all, if you take all 58,000 and you determine the average age of those
21.
23. And the highest number of the 58,000 soldiers killed, 14,095 of them were 20 years old. 20 years old is, in today's environment, what, maybe a freshman or sophomore in college?
Mm-hmm.
That haven't even really lived their lives yet. And I think 75% of the soldiers that were killed in Vietnam were 23 and under. Those are children. In my mind today, I'm 69 years old, so 23-year-old is just a child to me. That's the way I look at it. But a 20-year-old back then, 14,000 of them never came back. So I think that's one thing that people really need to look back on and think about when they think about the Vietnam War, that it was a war of children. We were all kids. I was only 20 when I went over there. I'm one of the lucky 20-year-olds that came back, but there were so many of us that were just young kids. I mean, believe it or not, there were actually 12 soldiers over in Vietnam that were killed at age 17. So I think if I wanted people to understand one thing about that war, was the youngness of the military at the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blaisdell.
Thank you.
This is Bill Blaisdell for the Witness to War Serving a Nation Project.
Thank you. Thank you both.